I'm Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Thomas S. Foley Institute here at WSU. And on behalf of the Institute, I'm happy to welcome you out to our event today, which features the former Secretary of Defense and Pullman native, James Mattis. Before I introduce our distinguished guest today, I want to thank the ROTC for providing us ushers for the event. I also want to thank the College of Arts and Sciences for their continued support of the Foley Institute. And I want to give a special thanks to the President's Office for helping us entertain our guests today. The Dean of our college, Todd Butler, and President Schultz are both in the audience in the front here. Let's give them a hand. For those of you who are not familiar with the Foley Institute, we were established in 1995 by a congressional endowment that honored the service of Thomas S. Foley, who served the citizens of the 5th Congressional District for over 30 years and was Speaker of the United States House of Representatives and the former ambassador to Japan. The institute that bears Mr. Foley's name continues his legacy through a variety of different programs that aim at educating the public about democracy and encouraging young people to pursue careers in public service. We do a lot of exciting things at the Institute, and if you want to know more about our events or our programs, I encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube station, to like us on Facebook, or to just send us an email at tsfoley@wsu.edu. Today's event is part of our Distinguished Lecture Series, and it's been literally 2 years in the making. Indeed, the General originally agreed to come to the Foley Institute back in 2019, and then, of course, the pandemic intervened. So we are deeply grateful to him that we were finally able to make this event occur. This is our first major in-person event since the pandemic. Today's topic, democracy at home and abroad, could not be more timely or important. Russia's recent invasion of the Ukraine shattered peace in Europe and is a stark reminder of both the fragility of democracy and the burdens necessary to protect it. Liberal democracies are threatened around the world today, from autocratic regimes in places like China, Russia, and Iran, but also from populist authoritarian leaders in places like Hungary, Venezuela, and Brazil. Nor is democracy entirely secure here at home. Bitter partisan divisions in our own country have turned Americans against each other in recent years, fueling distrust of our institutions and spawning anti-democratic sentiments and anti-democratic groups. What should we make of these threats to democracy, and how should we respond to them at home and abroad? Today's speaker has given his life in service to our country and has given a good deal of thought to some of these questions. James Mattis is a retired U.S. Marine Corps 4-star general and served as the 26th Secretary of Defense for the United States. During his 43 years as a Marine, General Mattis commanded forces in the Persian Gulf, Afghanistan, and the Iraq Wars. Mattis was commissioned as a Marine through the Naval Reserve Officers Training Corps after he graduated from Central Washington University. He is also a graduate of the Marine Amphibious Warfare School, the Marine Command and Staff College, and the National War College. Called the warrior monk by his peers, General Mattis was known in the Marines for his intellectual curiosity and deep interest in history. He published required reading lists for those who were under his command, and he expected his Marines to be well read about the cultures and the histories in the regions where they were serving. From 2007 to 2010, General Mattis commanded the United States Joint Forces Command and simultaneously served as NATO Supreme Allied Commander Transformation. In 2010, he was appointed by President Obama to lead the United States Central Command, directing the military operations of over 200,000 American servicemen and allied forces across the Middle East, a position that he held until he retired from the military in 2013. In 2017, General Mattis was called back to public service by President Trump, who appointed him as United States Secretary of Defense. During his tenure at the Defense Department, General Mattis warned of the growing threats to world order coming from Russia and China and strongly supported NATO and our other alliances abroad. His disagreements with the administration over the war in Syria, the Iranian nuclear deal, and over cuts to the Defense Department's budget led him to resign as Secretary of Defense in January of 2019. James Mattis is currently serving as the Davies Family Distinguished Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and he is the author of the New York Times bestseller, Call Sign Chaos, Learning to Lead. So General Mattis is going to give a few introductory remarks, and after that, he and I are going to sit down for a brief conversation, and then we'll have some time for some Q&A with the audience. Please join me now in welcoming James Mattis back to Pullman.
Thank you. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you, Dr. Clayton. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here. Some things in our lives are work, some things are fun. This one is fun. To come back to the town where I was born, actually it was the University Hospital, some 72 years later. I'm proud to be here almost on your 132nd birthday of service to our state, our region, and our country and the world. I would tell you, too, that after some of my public service, I don't often get invited to speak in front of polite company, so thank you for having me here. But more seriously, the Foley Institute's nonpartisan stance right now is a healthy, heartening, and productive antidote to the scorching rhetoric that we sometimes hear in our political discourse across our land. And trust it to be a land-grant college that houses an institution that carries on Tom Foley's legacy of putting our country's needs before his own or his party's. I would also tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that we meet in the spirit, I think, of one of your most famous graduates. And of course, it was then 21-year-old Edward R. Murrow in a speech to the National Student Federation of America as an undergraduate here, who urged his fellow students, and I quote, to take more interest in national and world affairs, which is clearly what brings us together today, why I was invited here. Now, I don't have the pleasure of knowing you all individually, but since leaving active duty in 2013 and interrupted by 2 years as Secretary of Defense, I've spoken on dozens of college campuses, met a lot of students. I love being around the students on all the campuses with your dreams and your visions, your questions, your passions. And I come to you as a co-equal from my perspective. We may be a few years apart, and I may have different color hair, but I can assure you I am here also as part of my duty. It may be fun, the fun part of it, but I was not in the Marine Corps for 43 years. I was in the U.S. Marine Corps. We're answerable to you, we're accountable to you, and you paid my tuition to learn my skills over that time. So I'm going to speak just for a couple minutes about this great big experiment we call America. I have a 72-page speech to give. I decided not to subject you to that, since it's a violation of the Constitution's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. We want to get into your Q&A, your questions, and see if I can match the wisdom of your questions with my answers. We are living in a tough time. We've been through them before in this country. It's a raucous time. Some people have lost some of their faith in democracy. They've lost some of their love, respect for their fellow Americans. They've listened to charlatans who say you should hate your neighbor or at least distrust them and treat them with contempt, which does nothing to me other than to make me more convinced than ever that we've got a great form of government where we can actually protect the freedom of speech of idiots as well as smart people. I would tell you, too, that I get a lot of credit for my service to America. And here I want to say something because we have many of the ROTCs from the two schools here in attendance. I get that credit usually as a result of the blood and the sweat of a lot of subordinates. And that's not false modesty to recognize I was a pretty average Marine who happened to be in the right place at the right time. And you get to my age and you have to know what did you earn and what was good fortune. And I had a lot of good fortune to serve for my first about 30 years among the rambunctious sailors and Marines of the Fleet Marine Force in the infantry. In the infantry, they're named that because they're young soldiers, infant soldiers. That's how they got their name. Most of them aren't old enough to buy a beer legally in this state. But they were mature enough to sign up as volunteers and put it all on the line, to sign a blank check payable to every one of us in this audience, payable with their lives. And they're going to defend this experiment we call America on its good days and on its tough days. But we are also at a point right now, when I talk to students, I recall a poet, and her name was Mary Oliver, who says, "Having chosen to claim my life, I have made for myself, out of work and love, a handsome life." So I'm here to try and support you in making a handsome life, but I want you to know that when you thank me for my service, this is my response to every one of you. I don't care if you're male or female or something else, I mean, whatever. I don't care if you're black, white, brown, yellow, red. I don't care where you go to church or synagogue or mosque or saloon for your spiritual embellishment. I would just tell you that you are worth it. You were worth every day of it. I was not a martyr. This great big experiment we call America, on its worst day, is worth it. And I will explain that to you, why I say that and how it was brought home to me by an enemy, by the way, at a rather elderly age that I've achieved. But I am concerned about America right now because I've read young Abraham Lincoln's talk to the Springfield Young Men's Lyceum, and his premonition that if this great big experiment was going to die, it most likely would die of suicide, not foreign invasion. That is why I come here today, for all the challenges in the world, less concerned with foreign invasion, foreign attacks on our country, than what some of us are doing to each other. I'm reminded of the answer Benjamin Franklin gave to the lady who accosted him the day he walked out of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. And she demanded of him, she said, "Well, Mr. Franklin, what's it to be, a monarchy or a republic?" And we all should know what he replied with. He said, "A republic, madam, if we can keep it, if we can keep it." For you young people who have seen horrible examples of grown adults acting like children, and selfish ones at that, whose mothers would have said, "Shame on you," this is not the way it has to be. You can grow up defending the rights of people you disagree with. You can grow up with respect for people that you disagree with. You can have a rousing good argument with all the passion in the world, yet lose none of your compassion for them as human beings, and ask them afterwards over a beer or a root beer, ask them, "Well, how's your son or daughter doing, the one with MS? How's your kid doing in college?" And go back to what brings us together. Don't believe what you're seeing right now as somehow an example of how a democracy has to be. Thank you. Remember, our founding fathers put together a very hard form of government with 3 competing branches. And just to really make it difficult, they added the Senate from Roman days, so you had a bicameral legislature. The only way it works is compromise. Not a dirty word. It's the only way it will work. So we're going to have to come up with the Tom Foley example of how do you make compromise. Not everything's a matter of principle in this world. Sometimes you just need to fill the potholes and defend the country. Churchill did describe democracy as probably the worst form of government, except for all the rest we've tried. It's up to you young folks to step forward and do your homework and care about the country, care about the people, but remember, you have an obligation to turn over these freedoms to your sons and daughters, just like we enjoyed. So let's get on with the Q&A here. That's always the best part, and I look forward to your questions. Nothing's off limits. I may or may not answer it, but nothing's off limits for you. Free country, right? Thank you.
Okay, so I've got to start with the elephant in the room, or on the television, I guess it is, and that is what's happening in Ukraine. I suppose most of us are following the daily headlines right now, especially today with President Biden in Brussels. So I'm sure there are going to be a lot of specific questions about Ukraine from the audience, but I'm hoping you could put it into some broader historical context for us. President Zelensky has called the Russian invasion of his country the start of World War III. President Duda of Poland said he likens it, and it says it's similar to the Nazi invasion of Poland in 1939. And Fiona Hill, who's probably the leading Russian expert in the United States, said, and I quote, she said, "People shouldn't delude themselves. We've been in World War III for some time now." And she referenced the Russian interventions in Syria, Georgia, Chechnya, Crimea, and now Ukraine. So I'm going to ask you to put your historian's hat on. You love history. How do you see this conflict in historical terms? And do we in the United States really have to readjust our thinking and our worldview about the post-war world, the Cold War world?
Well, it goes to the heart of like you said, the elephant in the room. And ladies and gentlemen, of all things, I'd quote a communist for just a moment. And it was Lenin who said, sometimes in a matter of a week, you can have decades of events happen. And in a matter of a week of the invasion of Ukraine, the latest invasion, remember he invaded also in 2014, you saw the events of a decade, or many decades, take over. And what do I mean by this? The Western democracies recognize we must limit this war. That is a strategic, what we call framing principle. We have to limit this war. It is not, President Zelensky, courageous, exhausted, inspirational, doing a great job, is calling for more and more help. The Western democracies are pouring it in. They're not giving him everything he wants. Part of the reason is that we cannot allow this war to expand beyond Ukraine. It's bad now. If you want to see Ukraine get forgotten about, see this war expand. So part of what you do on a strategic level is you choose the least of bad options, and that's what's going on right now. To put it in a broader context, you can always go to history and find things that you could say, well, that's like this one, or it's like that event there. And it does help illuminate the path ahead. And I think that's why you saw the American administration using the intelligence of our outstanding spies and reveal, starting last November, and every week and every day since, that we're reading the Russians' mail, we're warning the world, here's what they're going to do. By the way, here's when they're going to do it, and here's how they're going to do it. And the result has been that from Washington, D.C., from Brussels, where NATO and the European Union are, you see the democracies slow to anger. They've seen this go on in Georgia, in Chechnya, as you pointed out. They've watched it in Crimea. Now what they're doing is they've said this far and no further. It's over. We're not taking that anymore. And so based on the intelligence, the diplomats have done their job, the economists have put together the sanctions, the soldiers are flowing the forces in to give credibility to our diplomats, and the weapons are going into the valiant Ukrainians as fast as they can. The broader context would be the democracies, once aroused, are very powerful. And why is it? Because we may have a lot of arguments with each other, but when we all pull together here at home, when we all pull together with our allies and like-minded nations, that's going to give Putin pause. Will it be enough to take an angry, hostile, isolated old man and stop him? Well, welcome to war. It's unpredictable. But this is the one way we are most apt to limit this war and bring it back into the diplomats' hands and end this tragedy.
So how would you grade the Biden administration's handling of the conflict so far? And do you think there's more we should be doing? Zelensky's asked for tanks, he's asked for fighter jets. Some have suggested a humanitarian safe zone in the western part of the country. Should we be doing any of those things?
Well, remember now, you have to have a strategy when you get into something like this. Otherwise, you have no idea where you're going. So what we are doing right now is providing weapons that can be immediately used, and they have been used to telling effect on the Russian army. We are also providing diplomatic support. We're providing economic sanctions that are breaking the already sick Russian economy. I think that if I was to suggest more things, we should already be putting together humanitarian efforts, not just to help the people right now thrown into refugee status, burned out of their homes, suffering in the cold and this sort of thing, but tell the Ukrainians, you're going to rise again, the world's going to come back, we're going to help you rebuild, and you will be free. So I think we need to keep an empathy with the Ukrainian people, say, you're going to make it through this, as bad as this tragedy is. But I think the weapons we're providing, the intelligence we're sharing, more openly than I've ever seen our intelligence shared, at least in my lifetime, I think we're doing the right things right now.
Okay. The State Department yesterday, they formally assessed that the Russian army is committing war crimes.
Yeah.
Can we have a negotiated settlement that leaves Putin in power, or is our foreign policy now, stated or otherwise, regime change in Russia?
Well, that's a decision to be made. All wars eventually come to an end. And what we want to do is try to end this as quickly as possible. But President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people have made it clear there are some things that are non-negotiable. So we've got to stand by the Ukrainians. We've got to make sure that we don't lose track of our own values. But I think that that is something, as far as the war crimes, where we also hold the individuals responsible. There are colonels, there are sergeants, there are generals down there, and where we can track who did this, and frankly, with their lack of communications discipline, we know some of them by name, we can also send a shockwave through their troops that they're going to be looking over their shoulder for a good long time. So they may want to be real careful about thinking they're going to violate the Geneva Protocols. For those of you who have not read them, they're very interesting. It doesn't say you can't have a war. The point is they recognize war as a reality. Now, what do you do that is a crime within that? As Abraham Lincoln put it, putting on a uniform does not remove from you all the moral strictures of being a human being. And, for example, you cannot willingly and wittingly kill women and children. Have the Russians done that? You're darn right they have, and 100 other crimes. So all the president did was say, there are war crimes being committed. We'll have to sort out with the diplomats how we end the war. All of that will have to come together in the negotiations, but it's important we end this war as quickly and on as limited a basis as possible.
So Russia is probably the most immediate threat to democracy around the world, but China is the most capable and probably most potent long-term challenge. As I read the signals coming from Beijing right now, it's not so much they are pro-Russian or anti-Ukraine as they are anti-American and anti-NATO. Mm-hmm. I'm curious if that's the way you read their position, and if so, what that tells us about the future of Sino-U.S. relations. Can we contain our competition to the economic sphere, or are we inevitably going to have military conflict with China down the road?
Well, there's nothing inevitable about a military conflict right there. We can find diplomatic and other solutions that will work. But it is interesting that we find ourselves up against two diametrically opposing autocrats here, President Xi, President Putin. And you see now, as the NATO comes together, the European Union in teamwork with NATO, you see countries as far afield as Japan and South Korea, Singapore and Australia aligning with NATO. Either we're going to have a rules-based order or not. And that rules-based order was put in after World War II, and it's especially important for small and mid-sized nations because what it does, it protects their sovereignty. I think very few nations are going to look at China's role right now as anything other than full-fledged support for Russia. They have refused to condemn them. They would not do so in the United Nations. They have amplified the lies coming out of Moscow about chemical and biological weapons, and Russia had a valid reason to invade this peaceful, imperfect democracy next door with the people trying to build their own country. China has shown their colors, again, I might add. So what we're going to have to do is find a way to manage our differences with China. We're going to have philosophical discussions with China, not just about Hong Kong or Taiwan, South China Sea or Uyghurs. We're going to have the kind of discussions that we used to have with the Soviet Union as we tried to prevent, when we stepped on each other's toes, as we will, a nuclear conflagration. We do not need to have it go to that. So we're going to have to work on it, but we also cannot be naive and say, well, maybe there's a way that we can find common ground with China in a world where big nations can invade others and not be condemned in the United Nations. That is something we're simply not going to abrogate to the Chinese as the right way to run this world. So I think it's going to be tougher now than it ever was, and we're just going to have to find ways to do it. This is why I hope some of you are studying diplomatic history and military history here, which is not much studied anymore in the American schools, because we need young people to come in with fresh ideas that can help guide us through this perilous time.
Let me turn to a different region where you spend a considerable amount of time. That's the Middle East. And I know you have strong views about many of the actors in the Middle East, but I'm particularly curious about Saudi Arabia and how you assess our relationship with them right now. They are credibly accused of war crimes in Yemen. MBS has acted as a thug. He's killed journalists and imprisoned political opponents. Is it time to reassess our relationship with Saudi Arabia, or do we just have to live with it because of their strategic importance in the region and with oil?
Well, strategic importance also has a moral connotation. And certainly we are very concerned, and rightly so, in condemning of the murder of a news reporter. And that is the primary point. We have gotten used to the capability of the U.S. forces to fight a war where the enemy wittingly and willingly hides among innocent people, and we do our level best not to cause innocent non-combatant, we call it casualties. No other military in the world is as capable as us at this or makes it as high a priority. But in Yemen, it is a much more complex situation. They have attacked Saudi Arabia on many occasions. The Houthis have taken aid and support from Iran. Not one of those missiles that flies out of the Houthi area is built in Yemen. They're all built in Iran. And Iran's desire to hold the Bab el-Mandab, that is the straits going into the Red Sea, are well known. We read their mail too. So we sit here with a war going on down there, and right away, remember, in every war, the people who suffer the most are civilians. We have done our best to guide them so that they are learning how not to cause civilian deaths. The Saudis aligned with the United Nations in recognizing the government that the Houthis are firing against. That's the UN-recognized government. The Saudis aligned with the UN that asked to go to Oslo to try to settle the war. The Houthis refused, declined to do so. And strategically, if we are concerned with Israel's security, if we are concerned with Iran and what they have been doing from Assad, Syria, to murdering a former prime minister in Beirut in Lebanon, as you look at what Iran's doing, sometimes the world just doesn't comport itself the way I want it to. And you end up having to work with people that don't share all of our interests. But you cannot make this work if you do not work with the dominant country in that region. So we're going to have to work with Saudi Arabia on a strategic basis, and while never apologizing or looking the other way about our values. And so I think we're going to have to continue to work with them, and we're going to have to continue to support them. And by the way, the United Arab Emirates as well, a country whose leadership took the politically courageous step to recognize Israel, along with Bahrain, in the Abraham Accords. And Hanukkah a year ago, over 110,000 Israelis went to Dubai for Hanukkah holiday. And 110,000 Jews ain't all stupid, I'm telling you right now. So we're going to have to look at what are the countries that are willing to work with us. They're imperfect, they make mistakes. Are they willing to recover? Can we help them? Can we help them and guide them there? But we cannot surrender our moral purpose or our strategic purpose.
So before I open it up to the audience for some questions, and if you have questions, you might want to start thinking about them and lining up behind the microphone, which is right here on the aisle. I want to ask you about something with respect to domestic politics. Last year on January 6th, many of us saw something that we never thought we'd see in our lifetime. Yeah. Fellow Americans attacking the U.S. Capitol, hunting down the vice president and members of Congress. You're on record for saying, and you said it tonight again, that the greatest threat to American democracy is not our foreign enemies, but our internal divisions. So let me ask you, what was your reaction to January 6th, and how do you think Americans should process what happened on that day?
My reaction, at first, I doubted it. I mean, somehow I was looking at it and I was trying to deny it was happening. I've served in over 70 countries, ladies and gentlemen, visited, dealt with them, integrated with them, fought alongside them on the battlefield, whatever. I never thought we would see it here. I was disappointed, and by that evening I was disgusted. To attack policemen, to attack the Congress, I want to understand those who got to a position that they were so frustrated that they went along with this. And I realized it was not as organized as some who ended up there. They didn't realize. I'm not trying to give a blanket condemnation of everyone who happened to have gone to an earlier peaceful demonstration and then are encouraged to march on the Capitol. But I would tell you that this is what worries me most, ladies and gentlemen, because if we can't keep our friendship and our respect for each other, we are not going to be able to have a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Remember what I mentioned, Ben Franklin said, if you can keep it, a republic. It was just a few decades later when a doctor on board the ship, held on a British ship of the powerful British fleet, watched as that fleet pounded Fort McHenry and wrote a poem, which is now in our national anthem, and it says, "Does the flag still fly?" when the sun came up. He wasn't sure it was going to be there. Abraham Lincoln at Gettysburg, a few decades later, said, "We're now engaged in this great contest to see if a country conceived like ours, conceived like that, can long stand or will it perish?" And it was a country born with a birth defect, imported from the old world, slavery. And we ended it decisively there in the Civil War. But I've been all around the world and I've seen tribal hatred in every country's got some kind of tribal hatred, whether it be a tribe or an ethnic group or a language group or rich versus poor, you name it, it's there. The difference about America, I think, is we actually take it out of the closet, we shake it out, we point at it, we're angry at it, we do something about it, and we do something else. It doesn't work, so we do something else. We haven't always had it right. But thanks to our founding fathers, we have a marvelous opportunity to get it right. And right now, I don't know how many people are trying to get it right. There's an awful lot trying to score points against their fellow Americans, and that worries me. This is why I still go out and talk to young people today, because I'm convinced, having grown up, brought up by the greatest generation, I consider myself one of the luckiest generation. I am not impressed by what my generation has done in turn to pass it on. We need you young people to reject this kind of gladiatorial combat and start looking at ways you can roll your sleeves up and work together. And by the way, there are people doing it, the problem solvers in Congress. Many of them, by the way, young veterans, Republican and Democrat, who have lunch together once a week looking for ways they can work together. All the seeds are out there. Bill Clinton put it very well. He said, there is nothing wrong with America that what is right about America can't fix. And I believe he was right. Thank you.
So, democracies assume we're going to have conflict. So it's not a question of whether or not we can get rid of our disagreements and our conflicts. We're always going to have those, and sometimes they're going to be deeply held ones. The question is how can we restore a sense of common purpose and greater confidence in our democratic institutions to resolve those conflicts? What can we do? Should we have some kind of national public service requirement? Should we have civic education programs in our schools? And in particular, what can universities do? Some people think we're the problem, by the way, but is there something that universities should be doing to restore that sense of shared purpose and confidence in our institutions?
Well, I think on the universities, we've got to make certain we know that we're not there for everyone to be comfortable all the time. They're there to be exposed to every idea and let Hegel's dialectic take over. Let's argue it out. Let's come up with better ideas. But I think, too, that what we need to do actively is we need a covenant, and I'll get to that in a moment. But basically, we need to look out for each other. When someone's arguing about something you disagree with, reverse roles and see if you can find something right about what they're saying. If someone's being shouted down, even if you agree with the person shouting them down, say, stop that. Let her speak. Let him speak. In other words, stand up for freedom of speech. Don't just stand there waiting to clap when your point is made. I think, too, this staying in election mode. Okay, we run against each other. I say, I'm smart, he's not. You try and say, I got better ideas, you don't. And we're trying to divide you all, and one of us is going to win. When it's over, we then don't want division. Then to govern, we go into governing mode, we need unity. And at that point, we need to have compromises. I can't just say, I lost, now my side, that's 48%, are going to do anything we can to block you. If we stay in election mode, in divide mode, we cannot do the compromises that our form of government demands in order to be effective. So unless we want to prove President Putin and President Xi correct that we can't grow up enough to recognize the goodness in each other, find compromise, then we're going to be stuck in divisive mode. There'll be some issues we'll come together on, but not enough to turn over a better country to our kids. You know, this is a land-grant college, and there was a guy who believed in the land. His name was Thomas Jefferson. And he has a word that I never say if I've had more than one glass of wine. It's usufruct. And you see why I do not drink more than one glass of wine on that. But usufruct, basically, he said, you know, when you have the land, you can chop down the trees, reroute the water courses, you can plant crops and harvest crops. But your obligation is, when you turn that land over to your daughter or son, it's in better shape than you got it. I think it's critical that we look at this country that's been handed down by patriots who've paid and paid and paid. We need to look at what we're doing. Are we turning it over in as good a shape or better than when we got it? And that's got to be our goal. And let me just tell you about a covenant. And why do I say a covenant now? We've all talked, obviously, our whole life about a social contract between the governed and the governors. In other words, we give them certain authority. In return for that, we expect them to wisely make decisions, fiscal, national security, move the mail, run good elections. But Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks' admonition is that we must maintain a covenant and not just a contract with the truly important issues in our lives. And surely, ladies and gentlemen, I think how we treat one another is a pretty darn important issue. We got to live together, like it or not. And he said, you see, in a contract, even a social contract, you have an exchange, which is to the benefit of the self-interest of each. However, in a covenant, two or more parties come together in a bond of loyalty and trust to do together what neither could do alone. A covenant isn't about me, it's about us. Not self-interest, but identity and destiny. And so the social contract is still the best way for governed and governors to get along, I believe, especially in a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And that's where compromise is required. But I think we also need to see a covenant of commitment and passion and loyalty if we're to have a larger purpose to our communities. And in that point, I would just, you know, Madeleine Albright died here, one of the most admired immigrant, I might add, that I ever served alongside. There's a dinner each year in Washington, D.C., and by luck, I was always seated next to her. And I had the greatest talks with her. And I remember saying one night to me, as we were having a great talk about the Constitution, she had a love affair with our Constitution as an immigrant, hounded out of Europe by Hitler, family hounded out of Czech Republic by the communists. And she said, recall, there is no us or them in our Constitution, only we the people. I think that really sums it up right there. That theme, if we'll carry it with us, and we'll make a covenant of loyalty, of commitment, of passion for what we stand for, but compassion for each other, as we have a great time after the election slapping each other on the back saying, yeah, your guy won, but we'll beat you next year, next election. But between now and then, I'll work with you. That's what I think we got to do.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we have time for some questions. We have about a half an hour for questions. If you have questions, I'm going to ask you to keep them as concise as you can so we can get as many in as possible. Again, there's a microphone up here in the front. You can just come up to this microphone and line up there. As people start coming up, maybe I'll ask you a lighthearted question. You, for some reason, have a lot of different nicknames. Mad Dog, Chaos, the Warrior Monk. My favorite one is the Meryl Streep of generals. Which one do you like?
Let me tell you which one I don't. The Mad Dog one. Assigned to me by the press on a slow news day, apparently. My troops all knew my call sign was Chaos. And I don't like it because I've written hundreds of letters, what we call next of kin letters, to young men's parents who've died. And the last thing they need to think is that some general was running around, senselessly, mad dogging or something. Warrior Monk, boy, that'd be a tough one. Unless it's co-ed and got root beer on the campus, I'm not interested in that one. I would tell you Chaos is the one, for those of you who don't know how it happened, I was a colonel out in the Mojave Desert with a regiment. I had a guy from Brooklyn as my operations officer. You know how they talk funny in Brooklyn? And I'd go down to his office every so often because I was the command officer, and I got a great idea. And I'd get to him sometimes 2-3 times a day. I was brilliant, And one day I was walking out of his office, on his whiteboard was written Chaos. And I looked at it and said, what's that mean? And he said, oh, don't worry about that. You don't even know that. Oh, yes, I do now. And so I waterboarded him. Got it out of him. And it was my irreverent subordinates who decided that I was Chaos. I was Colonel, has an outstanding suggestion. They did not think all my ideas were quite so good. So what's really important for you young ROTC cadets and all, many of you are going to do well. You're going to be well educated coming out of your schools. You're going to get promoted. Don't let it go to your head. You're there to serve others. Remember, put others first. And if it starts going to your head, adopt a call sign that reminds you, you may not be as bright as you think you are, okay? Just ask the sergeants. So there's a quick rundown on call signs. I've been called worse than that, by the way, so okay. Thanks for not doing the others.
I didn't want to repeat those.
Yeah.
All right, if you have a question up here.
Does the strategic and logistical failure of Russia to advance into Ukraine in cities such as Kiev come at a surprise to you?
It's hard. There's an echo up here, so we're going to have to one step away from the mic and just talk to us for a minute.
Okay. Does the strategic and logistical failure of Russia to advance into Ukraine come as a surprise to you?
Surprise. Is it a surprise to me about what's happened with Russia? That's a great question. You never really know an enemy until you fight them. I had the good fortune, I'll call it that, because I protect this experiment we call America. When I was Secretary of Defense, we had the highly vaunted Russian forces in Syria cross the Euphrates River. They shouldn't have done that. And they advanced on us, and they began calling fire on our people. There's over 300 of them. I got the call, and from Central Command said, we've told them to get back. We've called the Russian High Command in Damascus. They say they're not theirs. And I said, how many times you called them? They said, twice. I said, they still attacking? They said, yes, and their rounds are now falling in the rounds. We're going to take casualties. So I just gave them 2 words, annihilate them. They did, and it was like shooting unarmed women and children. They were not impressive. And it stuck in the back of my head. I've been to Kiev several times. I've inspected their troops. I've walked the lines, talked to their troops, the ones who could speak English, or I had a translator. The fact that they would fight and fight hard, I had no doubt about. They were physically fit. They were impressive. They had been fighting in many cases. They'd been fighting for years in the Donetsk Basin out in the eastern area where Russia invaded in 2014. They've been losing Ukrainian soldiers, by the way, week in and week out for all these years, 8 years. They know how to fight. And it did not surprise me other than in the magnitude of the Russians' pathetic performance. And the result is they've hit what we call in a military campaign a culminating point, where they're going to have to pull those units out. They've been so chopped up. They're going to have to refuel them, rearm them, re-equip them. The equipment has not stood up. Their officers are not performing well. It's only a surprise in terms of magnitude, but I'm not surprised by how aggressive the Ukrainians have defended their country. And I've not been surprised by the conscripts thrown into this who probably the Russians who would rather be anywhere else. This is a strategic folly by Putin, and we can get into that if you want to talk about his strategy. But no, it's not a real surprise to me other than how expansive the rot was inside their force. But good question, thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Nathan Face. I was a NCO in the Army for 12 and a half years before getting out.
Speak up just a little, please.
Sorry about that, sir. My name is Nathan Face. I was in the United States Army for a bit over 12 years. I have a quick question about kind of tying the Ukrainian situation back here with our own politics. At the same point in time, while our media and our politicians are celebrating the Ukrainian militia for utilizing well-regulated arms to protect their own country, here in the States, and here specifically in the state of Washington, we are moving kind of the other direction and regulating or restricting our access to well-regulated arms, specifically with the magazine ban that is currently on the table. Do you have any thoughts on how the dichotomy between how we view those two militias, as it were?
Well, it sounds like apples and oranges, but basically the Washington State apparently recently, from what you said, has banned large capacity magazines, but we're sending weapons to Ukraine to defend themselves, especially their territorial army, which to you and I would mean if this was Ukraine right now, it'd be all the able-bodied men and as many women as wanted would be armed. No, I mean, it's an altogether different situation. Number one, we have a government that we can vote out of office if we want to. The Russian army cannot be voted out of Ukraine. You're going to have to kill them or make it so bad that we drive this to the negotiating table. So no, I don't think those things can be put together. I think, though, it's an area where for example, I understand that the majority of the NRA people are all for having background checks on who gets to buy guns. I've seen it. So I know there's areas where we can come together on this Second Amendment issue and find common ground. And I don't understand why we're not doing that. But I don't see the magazine ban here as being the same as fighting the Russian army. But I understand why you'd bring it up, and no problem, you know.
Thanks, sir.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for your service in the Army.
Hello, I'm an international student from South America, and so my question is a bit related to that. How should democracies think about the increasing cooperation between ideologically different authoritarian governments? The image that I have in particular is in Venezuela. The Iranians, who are an Islamist republic, helped the Venezuelans avoid oil sanctions. The Cubans sent spies. The Russians help with economic management and the like. How should democracies think about this cooperation between governments that would ideologically not be anything, should not be working together ideologically? And if you could specify how democracies, not just advanced democracies like the United States, but democracies like my own home country of Ecuador should think about it. Thank you.
Yeah, I didn't get all that. The echo up here. I'm going to have to stand up and get a little closer to you guys. You know, we're always going to have to deal with countries whose ideologies we don't agree with. And you can't just say, well, if I don't agree with them, I'm not going to deal with them. And let me put it this way. I'm going to expand your question, okay? And bear with me, because if I don't answer to the specific question, you're going to get another shot at me, okay? The greatest generation comes home from World War II. And they say, now remember, 20% of the boys who went into the Army in World War II had to be fed extra because they were malnourished, so they couldn't even go into military training. We have the opposite problem today, I might add. But so they had gone through a depression. They went through a war that we don't even know if it killed 55 million or 70 million. Can you imagine that? We don't know how many tens of millions it killed. And they came home, they said, it's a crummy world, and like it or not, we're part of it. They didn't suck their thumb. They didn't go to PTSD. They didn't suddenly decide that it's America first, we're going to forget about everybody else. They didn't do any of that stuff. They created the United Nations, never supposed to solve all the problems. What it was going to do was give people a chance to talk it over, work together, see if we can make it better, and it's worked 1,000 times. We hear about when it doesn't work. Then with Bretton Woods 1 and 2, you and I know the results as the International Monetary Fund. We've got the World Bank. And what it meant was if a country was losing hope, if they had no chance to create wealth, you now had a lender of last resort. You didn't need to turn to a fascist to make the trains run on time. I said earlier, I've learned a lot from enemies and foreigners about America. I'm having lunch. I'm a 4-star, so I'm old, okay? I'm a NATO Supreme Allied Commander having lunch with the ambassador to Washington, D.C. from a non-European, non-NATO country. And he said, after World War II, your country made the single most self-sacrificial pledge in world history. Really? I think I know as much American history as the Australian guy does. So I said, oh, you mean the Marshall Plan after World War II, after we beat the fascists? We went out and we gave billions of dollars 3 years later to Germany after what the Nazis had done, to Italy. We helped Japan get back on its feet. And who are our allies today, by the way? And the ambassador said, no. He said, that just shows how different America is as a victor, how generous your country is. He said, no. He said, here's what you did. He said, the Soviet Union threatens those war-ravaged democracies in Western Europe, and you go back and you tell the most trusted general, retired now, president of Columbia University, put your uniform back on. You stand up NATO with 12 nations, and you say, we're going to stand with you so the Soviet forces cannot come in and keep right on sweeping after they put in the Iron Curtain. He said, basically, after 2 world wars, you could have looked at Europe and say, we're through with you. That's twice in 25 years, we got dragged into this with you. We're going with Asia, Latin America. We're going with the Middle East and Africa. He said, instead, you pledged 100 million dead Americans in a nuclear war to protect democracy in Europe. It took a foreigner to teach me that. But my point is that we did that because we didn't agree with certain ideology and we were going to defend. We weren't going to impose democracy in Western Europe, but by golly, we were going to stand with them. And if you take that model of the greatest generation and walk it forward, and you see President Reagan and his Secretary of State Schultz, and they go into Russia, and President Reagan has come out and said, you are an evil empire. And people say, oh God, you can't talk like that. Well, what's a leader's role? Any of you who want to lead, there's one thing you must do. Up front, your responsibility. Define reality. Don't let people stay in a dream world. And then Secretary Schultz went to work, our Secretary of State. When he was done, by tying human rights to arms control, we reduced, between that administration and President Bush's that came in and had to finish it, 75% of the nuclear weapons on Earth were chopped up under each other's supervision, and over 1 million Jews out of Russia were allowed to go to Israel. That shows that you can live with people whose ideologies are very much opposed to you, and at that point, too, open the door to try to get along with Russia. And it darn near worked until a guy named Putin came along. So I'm not saying it will always work, but that's the model for how you take a horrible situation, build collaboration and a spirit of cooperation, and yes, trust but verify, something Reagan copied from a Russian novel, by the way, and you find common ground and you move forward. And history will never accept from our leaders, well, that was difficult. Frankly, I don't care. You do what is required when you're a leader. They did what was required. They reduced those nuclear weapons, and unfortunately, we lost track of that threat, and we should have kept on it. And now we, once again, are looking at this threat out of Moscow. So I broadened the question now beyond what you had, but what you were talking about is so fundamental to how we live in this world. You want to come back at me?
Yeah, you answered 75% of the question. Can I give you the other 25%?
All right.
Yeah. If you try to install like an Islamic republic like Iran has in China, they'd hang you as a terrorist. If you try to install a Chinese Communist Party in Iran, the same thing. And yet they cooperate with each other, authoritarian governments across the world
Yeah.
that are ideologically completely different, in theory at least, cooperate with each other. How should democracies, and I'm talking about both advanced democracies like the United States and aspiring democracies like my own home country of Ecuador, how should we think about that, and how should we interact with their interactions between each other?
I'd say have very modest expectations that you can, from external points, change a society. It is very difficult. I was studying the French Revolution, 1789. You know, they were not running toward democracy. Everyone says, see how it failed, and in came Napoleon. They weren't running toward democracy. They were fleeing an unjust tyrant of a king. So each country had its own culture. It has to come from inside. You can support the inside. You can reinforce it. You can, the CIA used to send copies of Solzhenitsyn's works during the Soviet era, and they'd shrink them on the pages and shrink the book so it could be hidden easily in a pocket, and they flooded them into Russia so the Russians could read their own authors when the Soviet leadership wouldn't let them read it on their own. So there's things you can do to help, but I don't think you can impose it. It's just one of those things. We've tried it before. It didn't work so hot.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Good afternoon, sir. You mentioned philosophy throughout your Q&A, and name dropped Hegel, which I really appreciated. Philosophy undergrad. But you suggested that we should have philosophical discussions with China, and to piggyback off that last little bit with the last student, when the United Nations was being formed, Eleanor Roosevelt kind of sat in on those discussions. The Chinese delegate, if I remember correctly, did have some reservations because they saw that at the time pushing Western ideas, Western philosophy on Eastern tradition in China. But I guess to ask you my question, what kind of philosophical discussions do you think would be appropriate that China would listen to, be receptive to? Is there some common ground between, say, Confucius and Aristotle we might draw on there, in your opinion?
Perhaps I should have used strategic, but I like philosophical as what would define the discussions, because there are ways, if you move it up to the philosophical level, human beings can find common ground. I've done it with people I can't even speak their language, but looking eye to eye and hand in arm and everything else, and in a little village somewhere or halfway around the world, I was able to make common cause with people. So I think if you move things up to a philosophical level, what you're doing is you're saying, I'm not talking to you right now about South China Sea. I'm talking to you about how do we resolve it if we have an argument and things are going bad. Why don't we start by having a hotline? Why don't we start by having certain rules that say whoever the young officers are in the two ships that are facing off, they both pull back 8 miles so they're over the horizon from each other. You can start talking more broadly and work from the pedestrian level of problems and keep working it out. I mean, eventually, like I said, Secretary Schultz did not start by talking about how many Jews are you going to let us, let go to Israel. He didn't start there. He started talking about what was the value to Russia of working with the West. And after we got some of that going, you have a little bit of common ground. Then you work out and you work out and you work out. We need to start somewhere. And I don't see those kind of discussions going on with either President Xi or President Putin. Now, here's the thing, it takes two to tango. And both of those leaders, I think right now, look at the disarray in the West. They look at January 6th. They look at NATO not working together on a lot of things and thought, they've misread us. They don't understand that's democracy. So if they don't want to do that, as I told my counterpart from Beijing, the Minister of Defense, I said, we're going to end up in a really tough situation. So we'd better figure this out. But we've got to have honest discussions up above each individual tactical event. And I think on philosophy, I would just tell you the U.S. Marine Corps is more influenced in terms of its combat strategy by Sun Tzu. And you know what I'm talking about when I use that man's name. The U.S. Army and much of the U.S. military is run with von Clausewitz or the Italian Douay or the American naval theorist Mahan. The Marines are much more run by Sun Tzu. And everywhere I've been, when I talk to Chinese, I can talk to them on the same level when it gets up above the tactical, it gets to campaigning or strategy. You can find common ground. Define it as you will. You can find common ground. If a problem won't let you, expand the problem. That's the best advice I can give.
Thank you, sir.
Sure, yeah, keep it up with that specialty. We need people like you.
Hello there, sir. You spoke a lot about compromise, but I just wanted to ask, how can you compromise with someone who refuses to acknowledge the same reality as you? As a general example, how can you effectively argue for more spending to study and prepare for the effects of climate change while the other side still refuses to understand the science behind it? How can compromise happen in that scenario?
Yeah, well, there are some things you probably can't. So you have to vote, and you vote for the person that you think is right. Once whoever wins, though, then you've got to try and go forward with what you think is at least a way to moderate that position. You're not going to get everything. In a democracy, nobody gets everything they want. So everyone's got to give up something at some point. The problem we have today is people take it as a matter of principle, any compromise, that paralyzes us. I'll give you an example that I ran into. I was at a rather small city, smaller than Pullman, and the example brought to me by a high school student. She said, in our town, we even got into a fight over which road was going to have its potholes fixed first. She said, it freezes here in the winter. Of course you have potholes. Here was a 16-year-old high school girl who had more common sense. And she said, and by the way, it only took 4 days to fill all the potholes in town. And they got into it, and she said, how can you make people like this see reason? I think what you have to do is say, even a broken clock is right twice a day. Just maybe that gal you disagree with, that guy who's being so obnoxious, has one thing to offer. Let me tell you how George Washington went about leading. Because really what you're talking about is leadership, okay? Remember these words: listen, learn, help, lead. George Washington, he's the most boring guy I ever studied, because when you're in leadership positions, you like to read biographies because you say, how did somebody solve this stuff? Then one day I started thinking, wait a minute, how did he take a revolutionary army of free men from Boston who talked funny compared to the South Carolinians, put them under Virginia grandees, and have Delaware boatmen who had their own boat say, thank you for your interest, I'm captain of my fishing boat, leave me alone. How did he take blacks who were slaves and promised you would be free if you fight? How did he put all this together and defeat the finest small army in the world, the Redcoats? And remember, they are going to humble Napoleon a few years later. This is not easy. So I started reading him. I read about him as a young officer, Continental officer in the British Army, French and Indian War. I read about him as a brand new officer losing battle after battle, leading our Revolutionary Army. I read about him now with Rochambeau and Lafayette, two French officers who knew how to fight, and they're counseling, they're teaching him. Here's how he would do it. He would listen with a willingness to be persuaded, not just listen to get your argument against them. Listen with a willingness to be persuaded. Then he would learn what they were actually saying or not saying. Sometimes he would pick it up because they were afraid of this towering general to bring something up to him. And so he would listen and learn. He stayed curious and non-judgmental, and then he would find a way to help them. Valley Forge, when the Continental Congress went away without voting money for blankets and socks, he went out and procured them. In a battle when things were going wrong, he rode right into the midst of it, right there alongside him in that tough thing, and they're probably going to lose again. He had to get the army out so it could survive to fight another day. You know, most of the time he didn't even have to lead. If he listened and learned and helped, he didn't have to lead. So try that as you go, and listen to really understand, not to judge. Learn, stay curious as long as you can, okay? And remember, even a broken clock is right twice a day. I've learned too many times I wasn't right, okay?
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Good evening, General. Thank you for being here. My name is Joel Velasco. Can you hear me? I'm a PhD student here in the sciences in plant molecular biology here. I'm also a combat veteran of OEF 0910. First and foremost, I'd like to thank you for your service as Secretary of Defense, mostly because, in my opinion, you served under the president that is a symptom of the rot within the whole of this. And my question with regards to democracy is, how can we preserve it when it's for sale? And I'll give you an example. We have senators who own oil companies making decisions with respect to future policy and how we move forward. Germany cannot stop using Russian oil, even though Russia is carrying out atrocities. And Saudi Arabia just beheaded 75 people, and we have to basically go along with these things while hoping to maintain our moral superiority and integrity. But as of now, like, it really feels like I suffer from depression here. Like, I'm studying systems. I'm very much interested in what we're capable of as a species moving forward. But it feels like it's all falling apart. And back to what I said, the last president basically demonstrated that incompetence doesn't matter when you have enough money and access to the information outlets behind you. Like, our information outlets sell war. I mean, it's amazing to me that generals are hired by defense contractors to essentially sell weaponry. So for me, the last great president was Ike Eisenhower, and he warned us of these perverse incentives, yet here we are today asking, what can we do? So yeah, how can democracy survive, sir, when it's evidently for sale?
Okay, well, right now, I would hasten to say that while Putin and President Xi think democracy has failed, there's millions of people who say, no, it hasn't.
I believe that it has not failed, sir. I love this country, and
I know you do. You wouldn't be talking like this.
I'm very much interested in our advancement, but we are hindered here at home by those who have the money and the access. Like, your former boss has more money in his coffers than both political parties. At this point, like, it's really it's demoralizing to even want to participate because
well,
of these
let me
things.
just remind you that on our worst day, it's the worst form of government except for all the rest we've tried. So we've got to keep the vision that you have and keep it vibrant, keep talking about it. Recognize, too, that many of the people you haven't met, they may not be as bad as you think they are if you sat down and had a beer with them, okay?
Oh, sir, I'm
You're a
under
PhD
no
guy.
assumption.
Because a senator who bought stock in ExxonMobil 25 years ago when he or she came out of college or something.
I'm talking about Joe Manchin today.
Pardon?
I'm talking about Joe Manchin and his holdings today. Yeah, again,
Well,
like, and it's not you, and again, I'm just saying, we can stop with this, but again, like, it's hard to
Yep, it
again,
is.
it's all about the system, right?
Welcome
when you have
to
perverse
democracy.
incentives.
It is hard.
Yeah, again, for me, like, if we do away with perverse incentives,
I think,
Oh, I'm sorry.
I think you'll have an answer then.
Yeah, and then I'm done. Thank you for your time, and again, I respect your service and all.
I understand the passion, and I respect it. But here's the thing. You might, if you sat down with that man who represents a lot of people there in Virginia, West Virginia, you might find there are good motives for what he's doing. If you sit down with people and talk with them, you can usually find they're not the devil incarnate. I would just suggest to you that you try to put yourself in someone else's shoes and walk at least a mile, and that usually takes about 20 minutes. And give about 20 minutes to read things that he said, not what people said about him, but what he said or she said, and keep looking for what you want, but also understand with respect that some people won't agree with you, and no one of us has all the right answers. So that's the best answer I can give you. Welcome to democracy, and keep at it.
Right. No, I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Hello, sir. My question is, as we see more increasing political polarization, as a country, how do we manage repairing our own polarizations as well as balancing helping the other countries in the world?
Say the first part of it again.
So, as recently it seems as America is becoming more polarized politically, as a country, how do we decrease that while still helping other countries? How do we pull back in a way where we could help ourselves without becoming isolationists?
Yeah, I think, I'm reminded of what the flight crew tells you every time you get on an airplane. We've heard it. In the event we lose cabin pressure, put your own mask on first and help others. You're in a rich country. It's not well managed right now. It's not on a good fiscal path. But I've seen relatively modest amounts of money go into other countries. And then for the next 50 years, and you know what I'm talking about here, the Marshall Plan, you see us accruing the advantage as we grow into the most prosperous country on earth. I think what you have to do is you have to have good, hard-headed people looking, how do you actually use help like that so it actually creates wealth? It's not just thrown down a bottomless bucket or something like that, or worse, corrupt country. But by and large, I think what you have to do is recognize we don't live on this planet alone. And the more we can work with other nations, I have fought many times for this country. Not once was in a solely American formation. I have slept beside soldiers I couldn't even speak their language, and we fought together. So when the chips are down, like right now, and you see all of NATO rallying around you, you certainly have to question someone who says our allies are just taking us to the cleaners. It was said in the last, well, you all know, I wrote a page-and-a-half letter about why I parted ways in the last administration from the best job in the world of serving alongside the young men and women in the military. And the reason was we had allies who had lost over 1,000 of their boys dead. After 9/11, our New York City and Washington, D.C. was attacked. They fought alongside us. And I am from the West. I don't trifle with other people, and I won't be trifled with. I won't show disrespect to a country whose boys are dying alongside us. And so when basically ordered to do so, I say, I will not do that. So what you've got to do is use whatever position you're in. You're a student. How many international students are you talking with to get their ideas? I'll give you an example. U.S. Central Command, 200,000 U.S. soldiers, sailors, airmen, Coast Guardsmen, Marines, and 50,000 foreign troops who trusted us enough, those countries, to put their troops under our command. You have got to look at the total input they're giving you, and don't just say, I gave them so much money, then what did they didn't give me money. Well, they're troops on the ground fighting. You got to look at it holistically, if that makes sense, okay? I could go on, but I want to get the next question, but that's a great question.
Thank you very much, sir.
Yeah, I'm afraid this will probably have to be our last question.
Okay. Go ahead.
Hello, sir. I'm a high school student here in Pullman, and I'm someone who's been looking into joining the military myself. So my question is, what advice would you have for young people today who are looking to join the military?
Yeah, for you young people, I will tell you this, some of the best days of your life and some of the worst are going to be in the military. And you'll never regret it. It will task you in ways that you will grow in ways that you wouldn't otherwise, because what you go into is going to take the veneer off you and others around you, and you're going to develop your character. You're going to be defined, all of you,
by how you deal with the toughest things that happen in your life. When at a young age, coming out of high school, if you decide to go in the military, you're going to have to meet the demands of people who are uninterested in your midlife crisis. You either deliver or you're going to get chewed out by a sergeant, okay? And it's not personal, it's just this country is so important to protect. Everything you do is going to be done for a purpose. And so in going into something like that, you're going to come out stronger. You will come out much stronger as you go forward. Few things will intimidate you again. The most important thing is tell yourself when you go in, you'll never quit, because they're going to test you. And just tell yourself, I'll never quit. And with that, you'll develop character that'll carry you through. I've met former Marines who stood up a company called FedEx, another one Domino's Pizza. I can go on, and they'll come right out and tell you what they learned as a corporal in the Marines is how they ran, their company, that sort of thing. So thanks for what you're doing at a time when it's an all-volunteer force. Thank you, okay?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Just one more?
One more.
Okay.
One more. I said,
Yeah, you get it. We're going to have to only take this one.
Cut it off after this, guys. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you very much for making me the probably to the probably last question.
You're the last thing between them and dinner, so you better get rolling.
I wouldn't want to stand between them and dinner. So, Mattis, I just want to say I highly respect you. I'm so glad that you're here giving this lecture. This is one of the only lectures this year I've been so excited to come to, so thank you. I just wanted to ask you...
Hey, Mr. President.
I just...
Graduate. An honored graduate right here.
I just wanted to ask you, we talked about the polarization, and you brought up Solzhenitsyn, and Solzhenitsyn famously said that the line between good and evil runs through the heart of every man. And we have a great issue in this country, which is we don't agree on anything, but we also don't agree on a hierarchy of importance to organize our problems. So my question to you is, how do we create a hierarchy of problems according to their importance, and how do we judge what is important?
So a hierarchy of problems. The challenge is the democracy, and it's the greatest one going because we have the most diversity. So you get more good ideas and bad. It's equal opportunity. I would just tell you that I would follow Einstein on each problem and then rack and stack them after you do this. I hear he was a smart guy. He said, he was asked, if you had 1 hour to save the world, he's alleged to have been asked, how would you organize your thinking to do it? And he said, I'd spend 55 minutes defining the problem and gain consensus that that is the problem, and then I'd save the world in 5 minutes. Many of the challenges we have today is we've thrown all these problems together without a hierarchy, and no one's really defined them to a degree that everyone agrees, yeah, that's the problem. And if you don't start by getting everyone on that sheet of music, then there's no way they're going to agree with the solution. It's the old idea, if you're going to have people in on the crash landing, they want to be in on the takeoff. You've got to get them in on defining the problem. But by defining it to a very strict level of detail, then you will probably more easily rack and stack them in the priorities that they need to be addressed. So that's how I would go about doing it, okay?
Thank you.
Yeah, let me just share one last story with you all, okay? And this is one, I talked to the boss and he said I could share. I haven't told him what it is. But I said earlier, that, I learned a lot about America from foreigners, including from an enemy. And I was a 2-star general in Western Iraq. The invasion's over. The Civil War has broken out. My division's gone home. It's been called right back in. The families obviously are putting up with this, but it's tough times. We go back in and all Hades is breaking loose. I'm losing Marines and sailors every day. I've got 29 sailors and Marines who run me all over the battlefield in 4 vehicles, gunners, drivers, radio operators, aid, and all. And there's a string of outposts that I'm required to maintain out along the Syrian border. And there's an outpost, and then about 5, 8, 10 kilometers, depending on the terrain, and another 40 Marines and sailors dug in little holes. It's 125 degrees with about somewhere between 89 and 96% humidity every day. Middle of nowhere, and Euphrates River off in the distance. And if we don't stop the foreign fighters coming in from Syria and Bekaa Valley, Lebanon, if they get into Baghdad, they're going to kill U.S. soldiers and they're going to kill innocent Iraqis. So every night, the Marines are out trying to connect with the other outposts. I pull into this young lieutenant's position, 40 sailors and Marines, and I pull in around midnight because we had to fight our way there. Of those 29 sailors and Marines I had, 17 would be killed or wounded around me in 4 months. And I was a general. I wasn't in the tough fighting. We're outnumbered. We're in an area the size of North Carolina. We have fewer troops to fight an insurgency than North Carolina has policemen. And the lieutenant comes over when the sun comes up, and he's briefing me. Here's where we've been fighting. Here's where I've lost men. Here's how many enemy we've taken, we've killed. And we're going over it. Young guy, fresh out of his undergraduate, probably a year and a half before he was in college. And how he's connecting and everything. And he said, we caught a guy laying an IED last night on the road you came in. That's kind of interesting, you know, a little personal. And he said he spent 2.5 years in London. He's an engineer, speaks perfectly good English. You want to talk to him? I said, sure, send him over when we're done here. So the lieutenant got done, took off, and pretty soon a Marine comes over with his rifle in the back of somebody, and the guy didn't look too good, not a good night. You know, he's out there digging a hole in the road and putting in 2 artillery rounds. He looks up, and here's 5 guys with automatic weapons pointed at him. For you older set, it means his 401k was in jeopardy at that point, okay? And so they bring him in, and I could tell he was Sunni. He'd been forced out of Baghdad by the Civil War. He'd rented a house out on the Euphrates River, about 15 kilometers away. And I said, what are you doing this for? You're Sunni, we're the Marines, we're the only friends you've got. Why are you trying to kill us? He started off on one of those rants. Oh, you Jews, you Americans, you're here to steal the oil. I said, yeah, right. I said, no, actually, I pull my wallet out every time I pump past my car. But you're an educated man. If you're going to talk like this, I'm not going to waste my time with you. So the Marine stepped forward to take him away, and he said, can I sit here for a minute, General? I said, okay, go ahead. And the Marine steps back. Finally, he said, I just don't like having foreign soldiers in my country. Well, man to man, I wouldn't want them in Pullman, Washington, where I was born either. So I understood that. We talked some more about his wife and 2 girls, 2 daughters living over there, unhappy they had to leave their home in Baghdad, which they loved for the bumpkins out in the country, you know, and stuff. He asked, am I going to jail? I said, oh yeah, you're going to be wearing an orange jumpsuit in Abu Ghraib for a good long time for this little stunt. You're lucky you're not dead. And he said, I want you to remember something here. America's got 2 fundamental powers, okay? Power of intimidation, and we need that. We need every one of you who's served in the military, every one of you who's going to. We need to defend these democracies. Ask the Ukrainian people whether or not democracy needs to be defended in this world. They'll clear any fog up real quick. But we also have the power of inspiration. And so it's time for me to be moving on. And as much as I love my Marines, I was thinking, boy, we are an inspirational country. And you know why I thought that? Because the question he asked me, my fellow Americans and international students, he said, do you think, General, if I'm a model prisoner, my family and I could emigrate to America someday? Now stop and think of that. He hates what's going on in his country. He's driven by hatred. And yet the power of America's inspiration on its worst day, when you're frustrated with your beloved country, he would give anything to be sitting right in this audience today, living in Pullman, and his 2 daughters going to high school or college right here. So keep the faith, work to make it the country you want it to be, respect each other, and make a handsome life for yourselves, because this is the greatest thing going in terms of opportunity, and help others, put others first. Thanks very much. Good question, huh? That's a really good question. Thank you. Thanks.
So we walk off. No, I'm going to take you out the back. Okay. So unfortunately, our time is up. I think these people would keep you here all night, and I'm afraid you would stay here all night and answer their questions. Unfortunately, but we have dinner to go to at some point. And let me thank all of you for coming out tonight. I understand there's a basketball tournament somewhere going on that's also kind of attractive, but this was much more edifying and equally entertaining, I think. Joining me again in thanking General Mattis for coming back.
Thanks very much. Thanks, everybody.